Now this is something very interesting that rarely comes up in comics. They don't look super similar at a glance, but I'll explain why I'm bringing them up together pretty quick. So I think this is a really great reminder for artists of any stage. I've been really wanting to cover some more Western artists in Illustrator Reacts again because it's been a while, and admittedly I'm more familiar with Western artists. But I think if I didn't cover Tite Kubo's art in this episode, then there would be people outside my apartment demanding my head on a stick. So this is going to be another requests episode, where I look at more manga artists that people have asked I talk about in this series, as well as some of the Western artists people have asked I cover. And of course, if you're new to the series and have an artist you think you'd like me to cover, make sure to check the pinned comment first, because I've done something like 10 or 11 episodes of this series talking about manga and Western artists. I've listed every previous episode and the artists that I talk about in each episode, so check there, because I might have covered your favorite artist already. But anyway, without further ado, I'm finally getting around to Tite Kubo. From what I've read, it seems like the art of Bleach is a really great lesson in why artists shouldn't let themselves get super burnt out. Tite Kubo was doing Bleach for 15 years, which is a crazy amount of time in itself. He was working ridiculous hours during most of that time, and you would assume that a lot of the best art would come near the end of the series because he's been improving as an artist over the whole time he's been working on it. But with my admittedly limited knowledge of the series, I went looking at a bunch of the art, and I was actually a lot more impressed with the stuff from very early on. So I went looking into why this might be the case. And there are a whole litany of different things that were going on during the kind of chaotic series of Bleach. Into the second half of its run, it was starting to face a lot of backlash from fans. Kubo apparently wasn't a huge fan of Shonen Jump, where the comic was being produced. He butted heads with his editors, and then most notably, in the last 5 years of the run, at about year 10 of him working on it, he started having some major health problems that were really limiting his ability to work on the series. And it's probably not a stretch to say that part of his health problems stem from stress from overworking himself on this series. And I don't want to lay into the later art and start dissing it. There's good reason for the quality declining, but I do think it's kind of interesting looking at what he was doing better early on versus later on to see the contrast between the two. And I think there are two most notable things between the art early on and later on, and the first thing that really stood out to me is the expressions. All of the characters early on in the comic have really big expressions. You can always tell how they're feeling just by jumping into most pages and looking at their face, which is really good visual storytelling. Later on in the series, especially close to the very end, I was looking through a bunch of the art, and in a lot of cases the characters just kinda look a little bit bored. Most of the time I couldn't look at a panel and figure out what that character might be thinking. And now you could also argue that in his later comics his characters look more mature, and it is easier for characters to look more mature when they don't have big, goofy, cartoonish expressions like some of his characters did early on. So that could be a deliberate aesthetic choice, but it is a lot easier to tell a story when your characters are really expressing themselves. Comics are, obviously, largely a visual medium. The more we can see what they're feeling, the more we're gonna feel it ourselves. And then the other thing that really stood out is just how he fills up the panels early on versus later. He's not an artist who does a ton of details with his backgrounds, either early on or later on, but early on he would always give us enough so that we could always tell where the characters were and the space that they were occupying. And when he would have a big panel that the background was left blank, it would usually be that much more impactful because it's not something he was doing really frequently. Later on, the backgrounds really slipped. He was rarely doing them. He was fleshing them out less when he did do them. And then there were also a lot of panels where he was just filling up tons of space with speed lines, which is kind of like a way of faking detail in the scene. And then there were some pages where there was just not really any characters. There were just kind of effects to fill up the page. Which, again, is fair. He was having health problems. He needed to fill the pages faster. And that's a way to do it while still telling the story. It's just obviously not as effective storytelling as having expressive characters in backgrounds and environments that we can understand. Kubo has shown that he is a really fantastic artist, and it is a shame that the quality of the art declined in the later years. But again, that's a really good lesson to other artists. No matter how much you love your work, and if you are an artist making a living as an artist, you probably do really love it, that doesn't mean you can't get burnt out doing it too much. If I can throw some of my personal life into this, I just recently went from working 80 hours a week to working 45 hours a week. And I think A, the quality of my art has gotten better, and B, I'm having more fun doing it because I'm usually thinking when I'm not working, oh, I'm super excited to get back to work. It feels more like a fun creative process than something I'm just churning out. Next, I'm going to do something I haven't done before and bring up two artists simultaneously, both of whom do lots of Marvel and DC art, and they don't look super similar at a glance, but I'll explain why I'm bringing them up together pretty quick. I'm going to push Cheeks Galloway off to the side for now and start with Arthur Adams, whose work kind of spawned the idea of talking about these two together. Now, Arthur Adams has been working in the comic book industry since the mid-80s. In 1985, he did a series called Long Shot for Marvel, and he's been crushing it ever since. He developed a very distinct style that's really nice and unique to himself while still fitting into that general interest kind of category. So most people who like superhero comics and see his work are probably gonna like it. Randomly, the most notable thing about his style to me is how he draws clouds and smoke effects. The cross-hatching he does in that is different from how he does cross-hatching on his characters, and I think it's a really cool contrast, and I really like how he does that smoky stuff. But he's probably more well known for how he draws things like monsters and creatures. He's really great at that. But back to this main art that we're talking about of his, this is a variant cover for Justice League 40 that he did sort of recently, and on his Instagram, which I'll link in the description along with Cheeks Galloway's Instagram, he was posting a lot of the process drawings for making this cover, all the way from the initial thumbnail sketches, to partway through the inking, to the final version colored by Tomo Mori. And the thing that really struck me is if you look at the initial drawings of his characters, how he draws his characters when he's planning them out and just blocking out the basic structure, they're really simple and cartoony looking, and they actually immediately made me think of Sean Cheeks Galloway's artwork. Despite the fact that they have very, very different finished rendering styles, where Cheeks Galloway uses a very reserved number of lines and usually simple cel-shaded rendering, maybe one layer of cel shading with a bit of a texture added to the character, and Arthur Adams will do much more intricate cross-hatching and lots more solid blacks to the characters. The initial building blocks of their characters are very, very similar. So I think this is a really great reminder for artists of any stage to look at Arthur Adams' early drawings versus his finished drawings and remember that no matter how detailed your finished art is going to look, it will only look good if it has a really good base, which in turn is a really good reminder of why the fundamentals of anatomy, shape, and proportion is something that every artist should learn as early as possible, no matter if you want to do really detailed comic art or really simple cartoon-style characters. And the nice extra step of once you learn good, realistic proportions and anatomy, you can then push those to figure out what you want to do with your style. The reason that I personally am a huge fan of Cheeks Galloway is because of a lot of the art where he really pushes the proportions of characters. This right here, while it's a very simple drawing, is one of my favorite drawings I've ever seen on Instagram. Now this is something very interesting that rarely comes up in comics, and I've definitely never talked about it on this series before. And that's 5-point perspective, or the fisheye effect. Now, I can't really do a whole rundown lesson on perspective in comics and art, but the three most common kinds of perspective that you'll see in things is 1-point, 2-point, and 3-point perspective. 1-point perspective is where all lines that aren't either horizontal or vertical are going back towards a single vanishing point. 2-point perspective is where there's two vanishing points on a horizon line, and all lines that aren't vertical are going back towards those points. And 3-point perspective has 3 different points making a triangle, and every line is converging down onto one of those 3. Those are all very common. 4-point is less common, and 5-point perspective, or fisheye, is very uncommon unless the artist is making a very deliberate choice to do something kind of funky with the drawing. Like you can see in this image, it feels kind of round, as if everything is sort of circling around this middle point, which is different from the sort of toilet bowl effect I've talked about in the past, where artists will use elements of the piece to make the composition bring you into the center. This has the whole image warped around a sort of center point, as if the whole image is being drawn on a ball. It's kind of unnatural looking, and it's difficult to pull off well, which are two pretty good reasons why you won't see it very often. But this is such a good example of it. It's not too dramatic, but it's very clearly there. And Kishimoto's done it so well that the characters look accurately warped, the background and environment looks accurately warped. It genuinely looks like this was almost a regular piece of art that someone took a picture of using a fisheye camera lens. And from my limited experience with Naruto, I admittedly just started reading the first volume, it seems like Kishimoto really likes playing with dramatic perspective. Even if you look at this other piece of what do you call it in manga? Like a splash art? Sorry, I forget the term for these. But even this, it's not a fisheye effect, but the perspective is kind of pushed a bit, bringing us in and making the environment around the characters look bigger. I just think it's really cool when an artist is not only really good at drawing perspective, but good at experimenting with it to really emphasize different parts of a story and make things feel more dramatic. Also, as a sort of random aside, I really like the way that Kishimoto draws trees in the first volume of Naruto. And people have warned me against talking about how manga artists draw backgrounds too much, because a lot of the time, manga artists will have assistants drawing some of the backgrounds. But because this is the first volume, I'm assuming that Kishimoto didn't have an assistant yet. They have just enough detail so that they feel fleshed out, but not so much that they're overwhelming everything else. And then I just like the general shape of them. I know that's kind of a random thing to bring up, it's just something that, for some reason, just really jumped out to me in the comic. Calling Tim Sale's art weird is a bit of an understatement. He has a very unique and sort of, at times, unsettling style that I think works particularly well in Batman: The Long Halloween, which is probably the comic he's most well known for, and I think they're actually taking a lot of inspiration from that for the new Robert Pattinson Batman movie. And I don't mean this in a negative way, which it might sound like I do, but I'm almost surprised at how popular Tim Sale's work is, considering how dramatically stylized it is. Usually when I think of someone that's as popular as Tim Sale, like Arthur Adams or Jim Lee, or if we're looking at manga art, someone like Boichi, those are artists who all have a distinct style, so you can tell it's their work, but it's also close enough to the sort of industry standard style that it's very appealing to a general audience. But Tim Sale's art isn't like that at all. He's never really flattering his characters with how he draws them. He does exaggerate muscles a lot of the time in the same way some other Western comic book artists will, but it feels different. A lot of times he's doing it more to make the characters look imposing than to make them look cool, if that makes sense. But then, the thing that probably jumps out more so is how he'll do some pretty warped faces on his characters. And this isn't a case where he's doing it by accident. You can't draw something like this Joker face by accident when you're a seasoned artist like Tim Sale. It's a very distinct look. Those long, narrow teeth, the really pointy chin and nose is done to make you unsettled. And he'll do that less so in things like Spider-Man Blue, where it's not supposed to be as unsettling of a story because, it's a Spider-Man story, not a Batman story. Batman characters generally a lot creepier. But he does still have a pretty distinct, sort of weird style. I don't really have a better way to put it. The first thing that ever actually jumped out to me about his work before I read The Long Halloween was how buff he draws Catwoman in that. I'd seen some pictures of it and I was just like, wow, does she have the Venom serum in her or something at this point? But no, that's just how he draws her. And I think it's a cool change of pace. It is unusual looking, but especially when you're reading a story that he's doing the art for, I think it works really well. I think he's an artist who has chosen his projects really well. I've never read something that he's done art for and gone, oh, your art style does not work for this. And that's also helped by the fact that he adapts it enough when he needs to. But overall, he's got such a unique style that's weird in a way I love, and I really hope that more weird artists like him start popping up in pop culture. Because the more variety of artists we get, the more young artists are gonna grow up with a big variety of artists, and then we're just gonna get more and more varieties of artists. And everyone can find something that really works for them and they're really drawn to. Is that a dumb and campy thing to say? Maybe, but I stick by it. Anyway, let's move on. Haruko Ichikawa's covers for Land of the Lustrous really intrigued me because of, and this might sound kind of dumb, but the placement of the text in them. And that might sound a little bit mundane, but it really is an important thing, because even if she's not the one placing the text, logo, title in there herself, she has to at least know exactly where it's going to be going, so she can plan her composition accordingly. Because you see, if you think about Western comics, 9 times out of 10, the title is going to be in the top, middle, and the artists plan their artwork accordingly, making most of the stuff in the bottom 2/3 of the page. And you can have some elements that are going up near the text, and sometimes have maybe Spider-Man's webbing going in front of the text, but they can't have too much important stuff up there, or else it's going to get covered. In manga, I've seen some more frequent variety in text placement. Dr. Stone's got stuff on the side, but usually there's still the title at the bottom of the page or the top of the page, and then there's a lot of room for the art to breathe on its own. But in this series, with all the covers I've seen, the text is pretty much dead center. And as a side note, it's not very bold either. So Ichikawa has to make sure that she's not putting too much noise in behind the text so that it's still readable. They do have a bit of a black fuzz in behind it to make sure the white stands out, but still, she's got to keep that in mind. And this is something that could be very limiting, because that text is going to inherently draw people straight to the middle, whereas if the title's on top, people might look at the title and then look at the art as sort of a separate thing, so you can compose it however you want and be really creative. But with that title in the middle, your eye is really gonna get sucked down into there no matter what the artwork is. But Ichikawa kinda plays with that and does some pretty varying stuff with the composition considering this limitation. If we look at this cover, for instance, it's a more simple one, and she's got us looking down through the image. Odds are you're looking at the character's face and then down to the text and then maybe through the rest of the image. And it's nice, it works well. Then if we look at this cover, she's got 4 characters kind of framing and emphasizing the text in the middle, a couple of them even looking up at the text to lead us into there even more. Sort of doing the toilet bowl effect, bringing us into the middle. And then this one is very different. We've got 2 characters off to the side, and they're kind of separated by the text, giving us a bit of a sense of distance between these characters. I don't know the context, but maybe they're in a fight, or maybe they're dramatically different characters. Someone knows, you can tell me in the comments. Maybe I'm reading into this too much. And then one more, if we look at this cover here, we've got more stuff bringing us into the middle. 2 characters' heads on the top and side are kind of framing that middle bit, and then that really curved sword is helping curl us down into the middle again. Admittedly, I do think I prefer when the text is on the top or bottom so that the artists can play around a little bit more and aren't really forced to bring us into the text, as Ichikawa kinda seems to be forced to do with these. But I do think it's a cool idea, and she's working well with what she's got. And it brings some nice variety to covers. Not all covers should really be the same. In case you can't tell, I'm a big fan of variety when it comes to artwork. The more different stuff we've got, the better. But that's all for this episode. Make sure to check out some of my other kinds of videos. I recently did a 1000 drawings and animations tour where I went over my last year of drawings and animations, showing some of my best stuff from the last year and some of my worst stuff. Then I also do a lot of Venomizing characters. I've done Overwatch characters if they were in Dungeons and Dragons, a whole series of that. Got lots of fun stuff on the channel besides Illustrator Reacts. And of course, if you've got more artists you want me to talk about, leave them in the comments. But again, check the pinned comment first, because I've talked about a lot of really great artists so far. But that's all for today. I'm Christian Pearson. This has been Popcross Studios, home of the nerdiest art videos on YouTube. Thanks so much for watching, everybody, and I will see you all in the next one. Goodbye.